What does it actually mean when a spacecraft goes silent? In real spaceflight, loss of signal is a specific, measurable event. The moment a receiver on Earth can no longer pull a transmission out of the background noise of the universe. Engineers have a name for it, a threshold for it, a countdown to it, and it has happened before, to real machines, documented in NASA mission logs. But a probe going quiet and a crewed ship going quiet are not the same kind of silence. One ends a mission, the other begins a different story. A ship that keeps moving, keeps carrying people, long after the last word from home has been said. The real question is not whether contact could be lost. Distance guarantees it will be. The question is, what happens afterward, once Earth simply stops being reachable? Get comfortable. Let us begin. Every space agency that has ever flown a mission uses the same phrase for this moment: loss of signal. It is not poetic language. It is a line item in a flight plan, a status that appears on a controller's console, a condition with a defined beginning and, usually, a defined end. And it has happened, deliberately, on some of the most watched missions in human history. During Apollo 13's return to Earth in 1970, the command module endured a period of radio blackout as it plunged through the atmosphere, wrapped in a sheath of ionized plasma that no signal could penetrate. Mission Control in Houston lost contact for several tense minutes, unable to confirm whether the crew had survived re-entry. That blackout was expected. It was calculated in advance, built into the mission's own physics, the same way every crewed re-entry since has planned for the same brief, predictable gap, and it ended. The silence had a known depth and a known bottom. Every crewed mission that has ever returned through Earth's atmosphere has passed through some version of this same blackout, timed almost to the second, because the physics of ionized plasma forming around a re-entry vehicle is by now thoroughly understood and repeatable. Controllers know, before the spacecraft even reaches the upper atmosphere, roughly when the silence will begin and roughly when it will end. That is the version of losing contact most people already understand, even if they've never used the term. A brief, survivable interruption, a held breath. Engineers plan for it, wait it out, and reconnect. In simple terms, it's a pause, not an ending. But there is a second kind of loss of signal, one with no scheduled reconnection. This is the kind that occurs not because plasma is briefly blocking a radio wave, but because a spacecraft has traveled far enough that the signal itself becomes too weak to detect. A fade with no known bottom, because no one has ever waited long enough to find one. Deep space missions are tracked by NASA's Deep Space Network, a set of enormous dish antennas, some spanning 70 meters across, positioned roughly 120 degrees apart in California, Spain, and Australia, so that as the planet rotates, at least one station is always facing whatever spacecraft it needs to hear. This arrangement was deliberate, built into the network's design from its earliest years in the 1960s, precisely so that no spacecraft would ever fall into a communication gap simply because Earth had rotated the wrong way. These dishes are sensitive enough to detect signals from spacecraft billions of miles away, transmissions so faint by the time they arrive that their total power is measured in fractions of a billionth of a watt. To put that in human terms, the signal reaching Earth from our most distant spacecraft carries less energy than a snowflake landing on the ground. That sensitivity has limits, and every limit, eventually, gets reached. For a mission close to home, losing contact is a scheduled inconvenience. For a mission far enough away, losing contact stops being a pause and starts being a permanent condition. The moment a machine crosses a threshold, it can never recross. The distinction isn't philosophical. It's measurable, and NASA's own engineers track exactly where that threshold sits for every spacecraft they fly, updating the calculation as each mission's distance grows and its transmitter's power slowly fades. Which raises the real question underneath all of this. If loss of signal for a probe simply means a machine goes quiet and a team on Earth stops receiving data, what does it mean for a ship carrying people? A probe has no experience of the silence it produces. It cannot notice that no one is listening anymore. A crewed ship would. Right now, at this moment, a message sent to Voyager 1 takes roughly 23 hours to arrive. Its reply takes another 23. A single exchange, one question, one answer, consumes nearly 2 full days. Nobody involved in that conversation is having a conversation at all. They are trading messages across a gap so wide that by the time a question is heard, the person who asked it has already moved on to something else entirely. This is what distance does to communication. It doesn't just delay it. Past a certain point, it dissolves the entire structure of back and forth. Consider what a conversation actually requires. A question, a response, a follow-up, built on the answer that came before it. Take away the ability to respond in real time, and what's left isn't a conversation anymore. It's closer to a diary being read aloud to someone who can't answer back. Voyager 1 launched on September 5, 1977. For its first years, mission controllers exchanged commands and data with something resembling real interaction. Delays measured in minutes, close enough to feel almost immediate, not unlike a slow but functional phone call. But as the distance grew, so did the gap between question and answer, month after month, year after year, until the wait stretched past what any live exchange could tolerate. Today, at over 15 billion miles from Earth, the delay has grown so long that no human dialogue happens across it at all. What NASA sends is instruction. What Voyager sends back is report. 2 monologues, aimed at each other, meeting nowhere in the middle. Mars offers a useful, closer comparison because it's a delay engineers already plan missions around today. Depending on where Mars sits in its orbit relative to Earth, a radio signal takes anywhere from about 4 minutes to just over 20 minutes to make the one-way trip. Any future Mars crew would already be living inside a version of this problem, unable to have a real-time conversation with mission control, forced instead into carefully worded, self-contained messages, each one anticipating questions that wouldn't be answerable for the better part of an hour. Voyager's delay is roughly 70 times longer than that. For a ship carrying a crew, the same physics applies, only the stakes change entirely. A probe doesn't need conversation. It executes commands and reports status, content to operate on delay, because it has no questions of its own. A person does. Somewhere between minutes of delay and years of delay lies a point where the ship stops being able to ask Earth anything useful at all, where a question about an unfamiliar mechanical failure, sent home and answered months later, arrives too late to matter, because the crew already had to solve it themselves or not solve it at all. There is a name, in communications theory, for this kind of transition: the shift from synchronous exchange, where both sides can respond to each other, to asynchronous exchange, where messages simply pass by each other going opposite directions. Every deep space mission eventually crosses that line. Voyager crossed it decades ago. A crewed ship traveling toward another star would cross it far sooner than most people assume. And once it does, it never crosses back. What replaces conversation, at that point, isn't silence exactly. Messages might still arrive, still be answered, still carry meaning, but the shape of the relationship has changed permanently. Earth becomes something closer to a memory that occasionally sends letters, and a crew, faced with a problem no one on the ship has ever seen before, has to reckon with a harder question than distance alone. What happens when no one, anywhere, can answer in time to help? Silence, in deep space communication, is not really silence. It's a number falling below another number. Every signal a spacecraft sends arrives at Earth mixed together with noise, faint static, generated by the cosmos itself, by the equipment doing the listening, even by the warmth of the receiving antenna. A signal is heard only when it rises clearly enough above that noise floor to be told apart from it. Engineers call this the signal-to-noise ratio, and it governs every single piece of data humanity has ever received from beyond Earth. Picture trying to hear one specific voice at a crowded gathering. Close by, the voice is easy to pick out. Move farther away, and the words blur into the general hum of the room, until at some distance, no matter how hard you listen, that one voice simply cannot be separated from everyone else's anymore. It hasn't stopped talking. You've just moved too far to hear it. Radio signals fade the same way, only according to a precise rule. Signal strength doesn't fall off gradually with distance. It falls off with the square of it. Double the distance, and the signal isn't half as strong. It's a quarter as strong. Quadruple the distance, and what's left is 1/16th. This is why a spacecraft near Mars can send images and full data streams with relative ease, while a spacecraft nearing the edge of the solar system can barely manage a whisper, transmitted for hours at a time, just to deliver a few words worth of information. The inverse square law isn't unique to radio. It's the same rule that governs how a light bulb dims as you walk away from it, or how sound fades across an open field. Distance doesn't erase a signal so much as it spreads the same amount of energy across an ever larger sphere, thinning it out until whatever reaches a single small dish on Earth is a vanishingly small fraction of what was originally sent. NASA's Deep Space Network exists entirely to fight this losing arithmetic. Its largest dishes, 70 meters wide, are built to catch signals so faint that a single one carries less power than a watch battery, spread across a receiving area larger than a football field. Every decade, engineers upgrade the network's sensitivity, buying spacecraft a little more range before the noise finally wins. But sensitivity, like fuel, like power, like everything else in this story, has a ceiling. Pioneer 10, launched on March 2, 1972, offers the clearest real example of this ceiling being reached. For 3 decades, its faint signal was tracked as it drifted outward, its power dwindling year after year. In January 2003, at a distance of roughly 7.6 billion miles from Earth, ground controllers received the mission's last confirmed signal. Not a decision, not a shutdown. The spacecraft's transmitter had simply grown too weak, and the distance too great, for its whisper to rise above the noise anymore. Attempts to hear it afterward found nothing. Pioneer 10 didn't announce an ending. It just quietly crossed beneath a threshold, and no one on Earth has heard from it since. Its sister probe, Pioneer 11, fell silent even earlier, in 1995, its power source having declined faster than the mission had planned for. What this means in practice is that losing contact is rarely a dramatic event. It is a slow erosion of a number, tracked in decibels, watched by engineers who know approximately when it will happen long before it does. There is no failure to diagnose, no malfunction to blame, only distance, patiently doing what distance always does, turning a voice into a whisper, and a whisper, eventually, into nothing anyone can hear. Distance decides when a whisper becomes too faint to hear, but long before most spacecraft ever reach that threshold, something else usually silences them first. Not the gap between here and there, but the slow, quiet failure of the thing generating the signal in the first place. Deep space missions traveling beyond the reach of useful sunlight can't rely on solar panels the way spacecraft closer to Earth do. Past a certain distance, sunlight itself grows too weak to power anything meaningful. By Jupiter's orbit, sunlight carries only about 4% of the intensity it has at Earth, and it keeps thinning from there. Instead, These missions carry something closer to a slow-burning ember than a battery, a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, which produces electricity from the natural, steady decay of a radioactive material, usually plutonium-238. There's no switch to turn it off, and no way to recharge it. It simply decays, at a fixed and entirely predictable rate, for as long as the spacecraft exists. Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 both fly on this kind of power source, and both have been losing strength since the moment they launched in 1977. Every year, their generators produce about 4 watts less electricity than the year before. 4 watts sounds small, about as much power as a single nightlight draws. But subtract 4 watts a year, for decade after decade, and eventually there isn't enough power left to run everything the spacecraft was built to do. NASA's own engineers have had to make choices most people never hear about. One by one, instruments have been switched off, not because they broke, but because there simply wasn't enough electricity left to keep them running alongside everything else. Voyager 2's plasma science instrument was switched off in 2024, specifically to conserve power for the instrument's engineers judged more valuable to keep running a little longer. A heater here, a camera there, a scientific instrument that had already done its job. Each shutdown bought the mission a little more time before the next hard choice arrived. By the mid-2020s, engineers expect the Voyager probes to be down to their final operating instruments, with total power exhausted and transmissions ending sometime by the end of the decade. Consider what that means. The spacecraft's location isn't the limiting factor anymore. Voyager 1 could, in principle, keep drifting outward for millions of years, carried by momentum alone, long after every instrument aboard it has gone dark. What ends the mission isn't distance. It's arithmetic, a number counting down towards zero, at a rate fixed the day the generator was built. For a crewed ship, power failure means something categorically different than it does for a probe. A probe going dark simply stops reporting. A ship going dark stops keeping its crew alive. Life support, heating, oxygen recycling, water reclamation, every one of them draws from the same finite, decaying source of power that once ran a camera or a heater on a machine like Voyager. And unlike an instrument that can be shut off to save power for another day, none of those systems can be switched off, even briefly, without immediate consequence. The New Horizons spacecraft, which flew past Pluto in 2015, carries the same kind of generator, and NASA's own projections put its usable power lasting into the late 2030s, roughly 6 decades after its plutonium was first produced. That is a genuinely long operating life for a machine running entirely on decay. But 6 decades is still a fixed number, not an open one, and every radioisotope mission humanity has ever flown has eventually run into the same wall. Redundancy is the tool engineers reach for to delay exactly this kind of failure. Backup systems, spare components, alternate pathways when something breaks. But redundancy, it turns out, doesn't prevent the ending. It only changes how long it takes to arrive. Every spacecraft ever built carries backups. A second computer, in case the first one fails. A spare valve, a duplicate sensor, an alternate pathway for a signal to travel if the main one goes quiet. It's a deeply reassuring idea that failure has already been anticipated, and a second system stands ready the moment the first one stumbles. But redundancy was never designed to prevent failure. It was designed to delay it, and there's an important difference between the two. Engineers describe this using something called single point of failure analysis, a method for identifying every place in a system where one broken part could bring down the whole thing, so that a backup can be added there. It's meticulous, exhaustive work applied to nearly every subsystem NASA has ever flown, documented in design reviews that can run to thousands of pages for a single spacecraft. And yet no analysis, however careful, can eliminate the underlying problem. A backup system is still a system. It still wears down. It still has a failure rate of its own, and stacking one uncertain thing on top of another doesn't make the total more certain. It just adds another clock, ticking on its own separate schedule. Reliability engineers have a way of describing this mathematically. If one component has, say, a 1% chance of failing over a given mission, adding a second, independent backup doesn't eliminate that risk. It multiplies the individual failure chances together, shrinking the combined risk, but never erasing it entirely. Every additional backup helps, but each one helps a little less than the one before it, and none of them ever reaches zero. Apollo 13 offers the clearest real demonstration of what happens when backups meet their own limits. In April 1970, an oxygen tank aboard the service module ruptured, crippling the spacecraft's main power and life support. The command module had backups. The lunar module, never designed to keep 3 men alive for days, became an improvised backup to the backup. Its systems stretched far past what anyone had planned for. The crew and mission control together improvised solutions no engineer had scripted in advance, adapting carbon dioxide scrubbers built for one spacecraft to fit ductwork built for another, using materials the crew had on hand: plastic bags, cardboard from a procedure manual, and tape. It worked. But it worked because human beings, in real time, found a way around a failure the redundancy itself hadn't accounted for. The backups didn't save the mission. Human ingenuity, operating under pressure, did. That distinction matters enormously for a ship traveling far enough that Earth can no longer help in real time. Apollo 13's crew had something a deep space mission would not: a team of engineers on the ground, thinking through the problem in parallel, running simulations, testing fixes in a mock-up before radioing up instructions. Every piece of that improvisation depended on a fast connection to Earth's accumulated expertise. Take that connection away, stretch it into months or years of delay, and the same failure becomes a very different problem. The crew wouldn't just need backups. They would need the wisdom to invent the backup's backup on their own, with only what they'd carried and what they already knew. In simple terms, every additional system added to a spacecraft doesn't just add protection, it adds one more thing that can eventually break. Across the length of a very long journey, years, decades, longer, the question isn't whether some part of the ship will eventually fail. Long enough timelines make that a certainty. The real question is whether, by the time a critical system finally does fail, anyone aboard the ship still has a way to fix it. Every signal humanity has ever received from deep space has traveled the same losing battle against distance, and every one of those signals has been caught by the same small collection of machines. NASA's Deep Space Network isn't a single facility. It's 3 sites, spaced roughly equally around the planet, in California, Spain, and Australia, positioned so that as Earth rotates, at least one of them always has a clear line of sight to whatever spacecraft it's listening for. Without that spacing, half of every day would pass with no one able to hear anything at all. The network's largest antennas stretch 70 meters across, wide enough to cover most of a football field, and even that enormous size exists for one reason alone: to gather as much of a faint signal as physically possible before it's lost beneath the noise. Consider what these dishes are actually doing. They aren't amplifying a weak signal. There's nothing to amplify. They're simply large enough and quiet enough in their own electronics to notice something is there at all, arriving at power levels smaller than almost anything else humans have ever tried to measure. Some of the network's receivers are cooled to temperatures close to absolute zero, specifically to reduce the faint electronic noise the equipment itself would otherwise generate, noise that would otherwise be loud enough to drown out the signal it's trying to catch. Even with that capability, there is a hard, calculable edge to how far this listening can reach. Every additional increment of distance demands either a stronger transmitter aboard the spacecraft, a larger receiving dish on the ground, or more time spent listening to average out the noise and extract a usable signal. Engineers can push that edge outward, and over decades they have new dishes added, receivers cooled further, listening times extended, computer processing improved to pull a slightly weaker signal out of a slightly noisier background. But the edge never disappears, it only moves. With current deep space network technology, spacecraft transmitting from beyond roughly 100 to 120 astronomical units, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 11 billion miles, sit right at the boundary of what the network can reliably detect, and only when everything about a mission, from antenna size to transmitter power, has been engineered specifically to maximize range. Voyager 1, already past that mark, remains detectable today only because its instruments were purpose-built decades ago for exactly this kind of long, slow fade, and because NASA continues devoting some of its most sensitive listening time specifically to hearing it, often using the network's very largest dishes in combination to boost the effective receiving power. NASA has occasionally combined the deep space network with radio telescopes not originally built for spacecraft tracking at all, borrowing extra listening power for a single critical pass when a mission needed every available decibel. It's a workaround, not a permanent solution, and it illustrates the same point from a different angle. The limiting factor was never a lack of engineering effort. It was always the physics of how thin a signal becomes once distance has had enough time to work on it. What this means for anything traveling farther still, toward another star, rather than merely toward the edge of our own solar system, is that the deep space network, as it exists today, simply was not built to reach that far. Not because no one thought to try, but because the physics involved don't bend for ambition. Signal strength keeps falling with the square of distance, no matter how large the receiving dish becomes, no matter how skilled the engineers listening for it are. A ship crossing that outer boundary wouldn't lose contact because something failed. It would lose contact because it kept doing exactly what it was built to do, travel farther, and distance, quietly and mathematically, did the rest. Earth does something for its inhabitants that almost never gets acknowledged, because it has simply never stopped doing it. The planet's magnetic field, generated deep within its molten iron core, wraps the entire world in an invisible shield, deflecting the majority of the charged particles constantly streaming through space. Step outside that shield, and the universe stops being gentle. Deep space is filled with galactic cosmic rays, high-energy particles, flung outward by exploding stars light years away, moving fast enough to punch straight through spacecraft hulls and human tissue alike. Near Earth, the magnetic field and the atmosphere absorb the overwhelming majority of this radiation before it ever reaches a human body. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station, orbiting within that protective field, still receive significantly more radiation than someone standing on the ground, but nowhere near what awaits beyond it. NASA's Curiosity rover carried an instrument called the Radiation Assessment Detector, specifically to measure this exposure during its journey to Mars, launched in 2011, and the numbers it returned were sobering. A round-trip crewed mission to Mars, based on that measured data, would expose astronauts to a radiation dose considerably higher than the career limits currently set for NASA astronauts working in low Earth orbit, a limit designed to keep lifetime cancer risk within an acceptable margin. And Mars, by the standards of interstellar distance, sits practically next door. To put this in human terms, radiation dose is measured in a unit called the sievert, and even fairly small amounts carry real, documented biological consequences. An acute dose of around 1 sievert is associated with a measurable increase in lifetime cancer risk and can bring on symptoms of radiation sickness. A dose of several sieverts delivered over a short period becomes lethal. Medical literature places the dose that would be fatal to about half of those exposed, without treatment, somewhere in the range of 4 to 5 sieverts delivered all at once. Astronauts aboard the ISS, protected by Earth's magnetic field, absorb roughly a tenth of a sievert over 6 months. A journey far beyond that shield, sustained for years rather than months, accumulates exposure on an entirely different scale. There's a second source of radiation worth naming, alongside galactic cosmic rays, and that's the Sun itself. Solar particle events, sudden bursts of high-energy particles thrown out during solar flares, can deliver a dangerous dose in a matter of hours rather than years. Near Earth, these events are tracked and warned for well in advance. Far from Earth, with no protective magnetosphere and no advanced warning system built for that distance, a solar event could strike a ship with far less warning than any mission planner would want. This is where the story of a silent, distant ship becomes something more than an engineering problem. A spacecraft's hull provides some shielding, but shielding heavy enough to meaningfully block galactic cosmic rays is also punishingly heavy to launch and carry. A trade-off every real mission design has to negotiate, and one that gets harder, not easier, the longer a journey stretches on. Every additional year spent beyond Earth's protection adds to a running total that never resets, never heals faster than it accumulates, and cannot be paused no matter how far from home the ship has traveled. A probe doesn't care about radiation. Its electronics can be hardened, shielded, or simply allowed to degrade without consequence to anyone. A crew is different. Every year spent beyond Earth's shield is a year the body cannot get back. A quiet biological cost, accruing in the background of a much larger, much more visible engineering story. One that would keep accumulating long after any message from home had stopped arriving at all. Radiation is only one of the costs a distant ship extracts from the people aboard it. The other begins the moment gravity disappears, and unlike radiation, its effects don't wait years to become measurable. They start within days. The human body evolved under a constant, unchanging pull toward the ground, and nearly every system inside it, quietly, depends on that pull being there. Bones rebuild themselves through a process that responds directly to mechanical stress, the everyday load of standing, walking, simply existing under gravity. Remove that load, and the body interprets it as a signal to stop investing in bone strength it no longer seems to need. Muscles behave the same way, weakening in the absence of the resistance they were built to work against. Even the fluid inside the body shifts upward without gravity's pull holding it in place, altering pressure in ways that affect vision, circulation, and the heart itself. Documented studies of astronauts aboard long-duration missions have measured bone density loss in weight-bearing bones, like the hip and spine, occurring at a rate substantially faster than the natural bone loss seen in aging or osteoporosis on Earth. Even with astronauts following dedicated daily exercise routines, specifically designed to slow the decline. Exercise helps. It does not stop the process entirely. NASA has real, detailed data on exactly how this unfolds, thanks to one of the most direct experiments the agency has ever run on itself. Astronaut Scott Kelly spent nearly a year aboard the International Space Station from 2015 to 2016, while his identical twin brother, Mark Kelly, remained on Earth, offering researchers something close to a controlled comparison between two genetically identical people, one in space and one on the ground. The findings, published by NASA following the mission, documented measurable bone density loss, shifts in gene expression, changes to the immune system, and alterations to the structure of Scott Kelly's eyes, some of which persisted even after his return to Earth. Researchers also documented changes to the length of his telomeres, the protective caps at the ends of chromosomes, often studied in relation to cellular aging, though most of these changes returned toward baseline within months of landing. Consider what that means. 11 months, under careful medical monitoring, with a full research team on Earth studying every change in real time, produced physical effects significant enough to publish and study for years afterward. A journey lasting not 11 months but a decade, or several decades, would push far beyond anything the twins study, or any other human spaceflight research, has ever directly measured. Beyond that point, informed extrapolation is genuinely the most honest answer science can give. No one has kept a human body in extended weightlessness long enough to know with confidence what happens after the point where existing data runs out. What can be said with confidence is that none of these processes have a known flaw. Bone density loss doesn't level off and stabilize on its own. It continues as long as the mechanical stress that would slow it remains absent. Some spacecraft designs attempt to solve this with rotation, generating artificial gravity through centrifugal force rather than mass. A real engineering concept, tested in principle, though never yet built at the scale a genuine long-duration mission would require. A silent ship, cut off from Earth's guidance, faces this problem with no doctor able to respond to a new development in real time. No updated protocol arriving from a research team watching the data unfold. Whatever the body does, out past the edge of what's been studied, the crew would have to face largely on their own, measuring themselves against a science that simply hasn't caught up to the distances they've already traveled. Not every cost of a long, silent journey shows up in blood work or bone scans. Some of the deepest effects happen somewhere harder to measure directly, in the mind of a person who knows, with total certainty, that no one on Earth can hear them and won't be able to for a very long time. Isolation itself isn't unique to space. Humans have studied it in extreme environments for decades, and one of the clearest, longest-running examples sits at the bottom of the world. Researchers who winter over in Antarctica spend months in near-total isolation, cut off by weather and darkness from any possibility of evacuation or resupply. Documented psychological research on these crews has repeatedly found measurable effects: disrupted sleep patterns, shifts in mood, periods of reduced cognitive sharpness, and a phenomenon researchers have come to call the winter over syndrome, involving irritability, difficulty concentrating, and mild depressive symptoms that tend to emerge partway through the isolation period and ease only once contact with the wider world resumes. Notice that last detail carefully, because it's the part that matters most for a ship that has permanently lost contact. Antarctic isolation is severe, but it is also crucially temporary. Every researcher who winters over knows a specific date when the isolation ends. That knowledge alone appears to matter enormously for how the mind tolerates the experience. Researchers studying these crews have also noted a recurring pattern they call the third quarter phenomenon, a dip in morale that tends to appear not at the start of an isolated posting, when novelty and purpose are still fresh, and not at the very end, when the return is close enough to anticipate, but somewhere in the long middle stretch, when the beginning has faded and the end still feels far away. A separate, more directly space-relevant study offers a closer parallel. In an experiment called Mars 500, a crew of volunteers spent 520 days sealed inside a windowless facility in Moscow, simulating the full duration of a round-trip Mars mission, including a built-in communication delay designed to mimic the real lag a Mars crew would experience. Researchers monitoring the crew documented measurable changes over the course of the isolation, including disrupted sleep cycles and periods of reduced activity and altered mood in several crew members. Even though everyone involved knew, throughout the entire experiment, that the isolation was simulated and that an exit existed. To put this in human terms, both of these studies involve people who understood, at every point, that their isolation had a boundary. A ship that has genuinely lost contact with Earth removes that boundary entirely. There is no scheduled resupply ship on the calendar, no countdown to a known return, no certainty even that anyone back home still remembers the mission is out there. What psychologists studying isolation consistently identify as one of the most protective factors, a known, trusted endpoint, would simply not exist. This doesn't mean the human mind cannot adapt to genuine, permanent distance from Earth. People have adapted to extraordinary circumstances throughout history. Crew selection for long-duration missions already screens heavily for psychological resilience, and NASA's behavioral health researchers have spent decades refining exactly what traits and team compositions tend to hold up best under sustained isolation and confinement. But screening reduces risk. It doesn't remove the underlying problem, because no selection process can fully predict how a mind will respond to a form of isolation no human being has ever actually experienced before. The psychological cost of a silent ship isn't a footnote beneath the engineering and the biology. It runs in parallel with them, from the very first year, quietly shaping how well a crew can keep functioning long after the last message from home has already arrived. A human body has decades of evolutionary engineering behind it, imperfect as that engineering may be for the conditions of deep space. A machine has none of that. Every mechanical and electronic system aboard a ship was designed, built, and tested by people working within a specific finite timeline. And every one of those systems begins wearing down the moment it's switched on, whether or not anyone is watching. The clearest real-world data on this comes from the International Space Station, humanity's longest continuously running experiment in keeping complex machinery alive far from a factory floor, operating continuously since the year 2000. The ISS requires a substantial, ongoing commitment of crew time, simply for maintenance. Astronauts routinely spend a significant portion of their scheduled work hours on upkeep alone, tasks ranging from routine inspection to genuine emergency repair. Life support systems in particular demand constant attention. The station's carbon dioxide scrubbers, water recovery systems, and oxygen generators have all experienced documented malfunctions over the station's decades of operation, each one requiring either a spare part already aboard, a fix improvised from available materials, or in some cases, a resupply mission carrying replacement hardware from Earth. The station's water recovery system is a useful, specific example of how far engineers have already pushed self-sufficiency. It reclaims and purifies water from sources that would otherwise be discarded, including the crew's own sweat and breath moisture, recycling roughly 90% of the water aboard the station, rather than depending entirely on resupply. It is, in a real sense, a working prototype of exactly the kind of closed-loop system a long-duration ship would need. And even this well-tested system has required in-flight repairs and part replacements over its operational life. That last option, resupply from Earth, is the one worth sitting with. Every time something aboard the ISS breaks, beyond what the crew can fix with materials already on hand, there is, at minimum, the possibility of a cargo ship. A scheduled supply mission, launched from Earth, carrying exactly the part that's needed. This has happened, repeatedly, across the station's operational history. A safety net so consistently available that it rarely gets discussed as remarkable, even though it entirely depends on Earth remaining reachable. Consider what changes when that safety net is removed. Every system aboard a long-duration ship, cut off from resupply, cut off from real-time troubleshooting help, cut off from the possibility that Earth could simply manufacture and launch a replacement part, has exactly what it launched with, and nothing more. Spare components, however carefully stocked, are finite. Skilled hands aboard can repair a great deal, but only using tools and materials that were loaded before departure, based on failures engineers anticipated in advance. The failures nobody anticipated are the ones that matter most, precisely because no one anticipated them. Entropy doesn't negotiate with distance. Seals degrade, metal fatigues, electronics accumulate radiation damage exactly like the human body does, just without the biology to notice it happening. Every mechanical system aboard a ship carries its own version of the same arithmetic, driving the power source and the radio signal. A slow, steady decline toward a threshold, with a timeline that can be estimated but never entirely escaped. What separates a ship that has lost contact with Earth from one that hasn't isn't whether things eventually break. On a long enough timeline, something always does. What separates them is what happens next. Whether the answer to a failure exists somewhere aboard the ship itself, in the accumulated knowledge and materials the crew carried with them, or whether it doesn't exist anywhere reachable at all. Every failure aboard a ship eventually becomes a question: what broke, why it broke, and how to fix it. For most of spaceflight history, that question has had a reliable answer sitting just a radio call away. An entire agency's worth of engineers, historical records, and accumulated expertise ready to be consulted the moment something unexpected happens. A ship that has lost contact with Earth loses access to all of it, permanently, at the exact moment it might be needed most. This isn't a new problem invented by spaceflight. Long before radio existed at all, ships faced a version of the same isolation, and one voyage in particular offers a genuinely useful real historical parallel. HMS Beagle, the survey ship that carried a young Charles Darwin around the world beginning in 1831, spent nearly 5 years at sea, visiting remote coastlines with no possibility of contacting home for guidance, no way to radio a question back to London and wait for a reply. Every repair, every medical decision, every navigational judgment call had to be made using only the knowledge, tools, and expertise already aboard the ship, or acquired along the way. Age-of-sail vessels like the Beagle typically carried a ship's surgeon, whose medical knowledge, however limited by the standards of today, represented the entire extent of care available for months or years at a stretch. Serious injuries and illnesses had to be treated with whatever training that one person carried in their own memory, because no consultation with a specialist back home was ever possible. A modern, long-duration ship would face a version of the same limitation, just spread across every discipline rather than only medicine, engineering, agriculture, psychology, all reduced to whatever expertise happened to be aboard. That voyage worked, in the sense that the ship and crew survived it. But it worked because the ocean, however vast it felt, was still Earth. Ports existed, other ships existed. Local knowledge, local materials, and local expertise could sometimes be found along the route, even in genuinely remote places. A ship traveling toward another star has none of that. There is no port to make, no passing vessel to hail, no shoreline holding materials or expertise the crew didn't already bring with them. Whatever isolation the age of sail once represented, deep space isolation removes the last remaining exceptions to it. To put this in human terms, imagine every book, every trained specialist, every accumulated repair manual a modern space agency has ever produced, compressed down into only what a single ship's crew happens to have learned, printed, or stored before departure. Not because more knowledge doesn't exist, but because none of it can reach the ship anymore. A failure that a ground engineer with decades of institutional memory could diagnose in an afternoon becomes, aboard an isolated ship, a problem the crew has to solve from first principles, with whoever aboard happens to have relevant expertise and nothing else to draw on. This is where redundancy and knowledge intersect in a way pure engineering doesn't fully capture. A spare part solves a known failure, but an unknown failure, the one nobody anticipated, built for a system nobody imagined breaking in quite that way, requires something harder to stock in advance. It requires a person or several people capable of understanding a problem no manual was ever written to describe, and inventing a solution on the spot, the way Apollo 13's crew once did, except without a team on Earth thinking alongside them. The ship, at that point, isn't just carrying its crew across a distance. It's carrying the entire sum of human knowledge that will ever be available to solve whatever comes next. Every angle so far has assumed something quietly important, that the people who left Earth are the same people who would eventually arrive, or return, or simply keep living aboard the ship. Past a certain distance, that assumption stops holding. Some journeys are long enough that no single human lifetime could span them at all, and any ship attempting one would have to be built not for a crew, but for a lineage. This isn't a hypothetical exercise. Researchers studying the real feasibility of what's known as a generation ship, a vessel designed to carry not the original travelers to a destination, but their descendants, born and raised entirely aboard, have published serious academic work on exactly what such a mission would require. One of the central questions researchers focus on is minimum viable population. How many people, genetically speaking, would need to be aboard at launch to avoid the kind of inbreeding depression that would otherwise doom a closed population across dozens of generations? Published estimates in this field generally suggest a starting population in the range of several hundred to a few thousand individuals, depending on the assumptions used, simply to preserve enough genetic diversity for the ship's descendants to remain healthy centuries later. This work draws on the same population genetics used to manage conservation breeding programs for endangered species on Earth, where zoos and wildlife organizations face a structurally similar problem: how to keep a small, closed population genetically healthy across many generations without new individuals ever being added from outside. The mathematics translate directly, even though the context could hardly be more different. A closed ecosystem drifting between stars instead of a nature reserve. Consider what that population number actually represents. It's not a crew in the traditional sense. It's the minimum size of an entire self-sustaining society, one that would need to handle its own medicine, its own education, its own conflict resolution, its own governance, across generations of people who never chose the mission, never met Earth, and never signed up for any of it. The original crew's decision to leave becomes, for every generation after the first, simply the circumstance of their birth. To put this in human terms, imagine being born aboard a ship you will die aboard, traveling toward a destination you will never personally see, carrying forward a mission decided upon by ancestors you may know only through recorded messages and inherited responsibility. Every skill required to keep that ship alive, engineering, medicine, agriculture, education, has to be taught fresh to each new generation, using only what the ship itself can teach, because no university, no mentor, no expert on Earth will ever be reachable to help. This reframes what the ship's survival even means. A probe survives as long as its power holds, and its signal can still be heard. A generation ship survives only if an entire functioning human society, complete with its own internal culture, knowledge transmission, and social stability, can be sustained indefinitely inside a sealed metal environment, for far longer than any human civilization on Earth has ever managed to remain stable and unified in one place. Success, under those terms, stops being defined by arrival. A generation ship that never reaches its destination, but still maintains a stable, functioning society for centuries, has, in a very real sense, already succeeded at the hardest part of the problem, and one that reaches its destination but arrives having lost its cohesion, its knowledge, or its purpose along the way, has failed at something engineering alone could never have prevented. Some researchers in this field have pointed out an uncomfortable possibility worth naming honestly. If propulsion technology continues improving after a generation ship departs, a later, faster vessel launched decades afterward could theoretically overtake and arrive before the original ship does. It's a scenario that has actually been studied under names like the weight equation, a real question in mission planning about whether departing sooner on slower technology is wiser than waiting for something faster. There's no settled answer. It depends entirely on assumptions about future engineering that nobody can make with real confidence today. Every problem this journey has raised so far, the radiation, the biology, the isolation, the unanswerable failures, even the raising of children who will never see Earth, assumes one thing underneath all of it, that the ship has power. Take that away, and every other problem stops mattering, because nothing aboard continues functioning at all. This is where the story circles back to something already introduced, but worth returning to with sharper focus. Voyager's radioisotope generators, decaying at a steady, predictable rate, illustrate a principle that applies to any ship relying on nuclear decay for power, the same principle governing every radioactive material in the universe. Each isotope has a half-life, a fixed span of time in which exactly half of it decays away, regardless of how it's used, how carefully it's managed, or how badly its power is needed. Plutonium-238, the isotope Voyager and most deep space missions rely on, has a half-life of about 87.5 years. After that span, only half the original fuel remains. After another 87.5 years, only a quarter. The decline never stops, and unlike nearly every other kind of running out, a fuel tank, a battery, a food supply, it cannot be conserved, rationed, or extended through careful use. It happens at the same rate whether the power is being used or not. Consider what this means for a ship attempting a journey measured in decades or centuries rather than years. A power source generous enough to run every system at launch inevitably becomes, decades later, a fraction of that original supply. Not because anything failed, but because the fuel itself is quietly, physically transforming into something else, atom by atom, on a schedule no engineering decision can slow down. This is why real proposals for genuinely long-duration missions look toward nuclear fission reactors rather than radioisotope decay alone, since a controlled fission reaction can generate dramatically more power for a given mass of fuel and can, in principle, be throttled and managed rather than simply left to decay on its own fixed timeline. NASA and other agencies have real, ongoing research programs into compact fission power systems for exactly this reason, including a demonstration project called Kilopower, tested on Earth in 2018, designed to prove that a small, safe fission reactor could one day supply continuous power for missions well beyond what radioisotope generators alone could manage. But even fission fuel is finite. Even a reactor eventually runs out of material capable of sustaining the reaction, just on a longer clock than a radioisotope generator's steady decay. Some theoretical designs look further still, toward nuclear fusion, the same reaction that powers the sun, which would offer a vastly larger energy reserve per unit of fuel than fission ever could. No fusion reactor has yet been built that produces sustained, usable net power on Earth, let alone one compact and reliable enough to fly on a spacecraft. It remains, honestly, a genuine open engineering question rather than a settled technology. What this means in practice is that every ship, no matter how it generates power, is operating against a deadline that was fixed the day it launched, encoded in the physics of whatever fuel it carries. The only real variable is how long that deadline can be pushed outward, and by how much better the engineering becomes between now and whenever such a ship might actually depart. Every system this story has walked through, the radio, the life support, the repairs, the newborn generations learning to keep the ship alive, ultimately draws from the same finite well. And when that well runs dry, not suddenly, but gradually, the same way Voyager's 4 watts a year have been quietly disappearing since 1977, everything else this story has described begins running out right alongside it. Everything discussed so far has been, in one sense, a thought experiment: power decay, radiation exposure, generational survival, all reasoned out from physics and biology and history. But there is one place where much of this isn't theoretical at all. It's already happening, right now, to a real spacecraft, and has been for nearly half a century. Voyager 1 launched on September 5, 1977, just weeks after its twin, Voyager 2. It is, at this point, the most distant human-made object in existence, traveling farther from Earth with every passing second. It crossed the heliopause in August 2012, the boundary where the sun's solar wind finally loses its long battle against the pressure of the space between stars, and has been traveling through interstellar space ever since, the only object built by human hands to have done so and kept transmitting home. Voyager 2 followed it across that same boundary in November 2018, 6 years later, taking a different route out of the solar system and confirming, independently, much of what Voyager 1 had already found. Its power has been declining steadily the entire time, exactly as its radioisotope generator's decay curve always predicted it would. Instruments have been shut down deliberately, one by one, to stretch the mission's remaining years as far as engineers could manage. NASA's own projections, publicly stated, anticipate that Voyager 1 will run out of enough power to operate any instrument at all sometime around the latter half of this decade. A slow, foreseen ending, not a sudden one, arriving on the same predictable schedule its power source has followed since the day it launched. Consider what this actually represents. A machine, launched before most of its current mission engineers were even born, has spent nearly 50 years traveling farther from home than anything else humanity has ever built, all while faithfully reporting back exactly what it was designed to report. It has outlived entire careers. It has outlived some of the very engineers who launched it, and it will keep traveling long after its last transmission, carried by momentum alone through a darkness with no meaningful endpoint, for millions of years after its voice finally goes quiet for good. Both Voyager probes carry a golden record, a phonograph disc etched with sounds and images meant to represent Earth to whoever, if anyone, might ever find it. A message with no expected reader, sent anyway. This is the closest real precedent that exists for everything this story has described. Not a person, not a crew, but a machine that has already lived through decades of the exact isolation a crewed ship would eventually face: declining power, growing distance, and a connection to Earth stretched thinner every single year, until it will, eventually, break entirely. Voyager's builders couldn't know, in 1977, that their spacecraft would still be transmitting home in the 21st century. And yet it has, for far longer than almost anyone involved ever expected. A crewed ship, of course, isn't a probe. It carries people, not just instruments, and everything this story has walked through, the biology, the psychology, the knowledge, the generations, belongs only to a ship carrying something a probe never had to carry, a mind aware of its own isolation. But Voyager offers something valuable anyway. Proof, already collected, already real, that distance and time don't have to mean immediate failure, that something built carefully enough and left alone long enough, can keep going, quietly, faithfully, for far longer than anyone standing at the launch pad ever dared to promise. Engineers who worked on the original Voyager missions have said, in interviews given decades after launch, that no one on the team seriously expected the spacecraft to still be operating this far into the 21st century. The mission was designed around a primary tour of 4 to 5 years, covering flybys of Jupiter and Saturn. Everything after that has been, in the most literal sense, a bonus that nobody planned for, but everybody has been grateful to receive. By this point in the story, the word survival has been used to mean several different things, and it's worth sitting, quietly, with how much that word has shifted. At the start, survival meant something mechanical, a signal strong enough to rise above the noise floor, a power source with enough decay years left in it, a system that hadn't yet failed beyond the ship's ability to repair it. That kind of survival can be measured, tracked, predicted with real numbers, the way engineers track Voyager's 4 watts a year, counting down toward a known, calculable ending. But somewhere in the middle of this story, survival stopped being only mechanical. A body can technically be alive while losing bone density it will never fully recover. A mind can technically be functioning while carrying the particular, permanent weight of knowing that no one, anywhere, is listening anymore. A ship's systems might hold for decades, while the meaning of the mission itself quietly transforms into something none of the people who launched it ever quite anticipated. Somewhere back at the beginning, this story asked what it would mean for a signal to fade below what the Deep Space Network could hear. The honest answer, threaded through every angle since, is that the signal fading was never really the ending. It was only the moment the story stopped being about Earth's part in it and became entirely about the ships. A generation ship's descendants, born and raised without ever having known a world outside their own vessel, would likely not experience their existence as isolation at all. Isolation requires a felt absence of something once had. For them, the ship simply is the world, the only one they've ever known, no more strange to them than Earth is strange to the people listening to these words right now. Survival, for them, wouldn't be measured against a memory of home. It would simply mean waking up, tomorrow, inside the only home they've ever had. This is, perhaps, the quiet resolution sitting underneath every angle this story has walked through. Contact with Earth ending doesn't have to mean the ship's story ending. It means the story changes hands, from a mission defined by its connection to the place it left, to a life defined entirely by what continues aboard it, unwitnessed, unrecorded by anyone back home, but no less real for going unseen. There is something almost peaceful in that thought, if you let yourself sit with it. Every measurement this story has walked through, the watts, the sieverts, the decay rates, the population minimums, was always Earth's way of trying to hold on to something it could no longer reach. The ship itself would have no need for any of it. It would simply continue, the way a river continues past the point where anyone stopped watching it. Somewhere out past the edge of what any Deep Space Network dish could ever detect, a ship might still be traveling, its power still declining, exactly as predicted, on schedule, the same slow arithmetic that has governed every generator and every isotope this whole time. Its people, whoever they've become by then, still living, still learning, still solving whatever problem happens to be in front of them that day, the way people always eventually learn to do. Earth would have no way of knowing any of it, and it wouldn't need to. The ship's survival was never really about being heard. There's one question this story has circled without quite asking directly. Not whether a ship could survive the going. Whether anything, in the end, could ever come back. For some journeys, the ones bound only for the edge of the solar system or a nearby star system reached in a matter of decades, return remains at least physically conceivable. A ship could turn around. A crew, or their descendants, could point the vessel back toward the pale, distant light of the sun and begin the long journey home. Whether Earth, generations later, would still recognize them, or they it, is a separate question entirely. But the physics, at least, would allow the attempt. For a generation ship traveling far enough, aimed at a destination that only distant descendants would ever reach, return stops being a realistic question at all. The people who left are gone long before arrival. The people who arrive were never the people who left. And Earth itself, across centuries or millennia of separation, would have continued forward without them. Its politics, its languages, its entire sense of itself, reshaped by time in ways no message, however eventually received, could ever fully explain to someone hearing it generations late. There's a strange asymmetry buried in this that's worth naming plainly. Earth would age forward in the ordinary way, 1 year at a time, its history accumulating in the usual fashion. But from Earth's perspective, the ship would simply vanish from the story the moment its last signal faded, not dead, not destroyed, just absent from every record anyone could keep. Two histories, running in parallel, with no way for either to check in on the other again. Think of it from the other direction for a moment. Even if such a ship somehow regained the ability to transmit, and even if a message did cross the distance back to Earth, whoever received it would be listening to words sent by people who, by the time the message arrived, might have been gone for centuries. It would be less a conversation resumed than a voice arriving from something closer to history than from anyone still living. This is, in its own way, the most honest answer this whole story can offer. A ship's survival was never really contingent on Earth's continued attention. It was never contingent on a successful return, or a triumphant re-establishment of contact, or a hero's welcome for travelers who left everyone they knew behind. Survival, all along, has simply meant continuing, the generator still producing its shrinking wattage, the crew, or their children, or their children's children, still solving the next problem, still teaching the next generation what the last one learned, still moving forward through a darkness that was never actually empty, just quiet. Whether anyone on Earth ever hears from that ship again may not, in the end, be the measure that matters most. A voice doesn't stop being real the moment no one is left to hear it. It simply becomes a voice, speaking into a silence that was always, from the very beginning, part of the deal. Somewhere out there, whether such a ship exists yet or not, that quiet continuation is what real survival would actually look like. Not a triumphant return, not a message finally received, just a ship still moving, still lived in, still mattering entirely to the people who call it home, whether or not the rest of the universe is listening. You've been listening to a story about silence, not the absence of sound, but the absence of an audience. What happens to a voice, a signal, a life, once the people meant to receive it are simply too far away to ever hear it again? Somewhere in the last hour and a half, the question quietly changed shape. It stopped being about whether a starship could survive losing contact with Earth, and became something closer to what survival even means once the listening stops. A signal fading below the noise floor of the deep space network. A power source, decaying on a schedule, fixed the day it was built. A body slowly adjusting to an absence of gravity science has only begun to understand. A mind learning to hold a permanence no Antarctic winter or simulated isolation chamber ever truly had to hold. A knowledge base narrowing down to only what a ship happened to carry aboard it. A generation, and then another, and then another, growing up entirely inside a world with no outside. None of these problems disappear simply because no one on Earth is around to witness them being solved. If anything, they become more real, not less. A story that keeps unfolding, faithfully, in the dark, whether or not this planet ever learns how it ends. Voyager 1 is out there right now, decades into its own version of this same slow fade, still transmitting, still faithful, still counting down the same 4 watts a year it always has. It doesn't know it's teaching us anything. It's simply doing what it was built to do, for as long as its dwindling power allows it to keep doing it. A crewed ship, someday, might do the same, not returning triumphantly, not delivering some final, satisfying message home, just continuing, a hull moving quietly through a darkness that was never really empty, carrying people who learned, the way people always eventually learn, how to keep living inside whatever world they were given. Contact was never really the point. It never is in the end. What matters is only ever what continues once no one else is watching. Every engineer who has ever tracked a fading signal, every researcher who has ever studied a body or a mind adapting to isolation, has been quietly circling the same truth from a different angle. That distance changes what can be measured, but it never changes what is real. Everything this story has described is already happening somewhere, in some smaller form. A probe still counting down its final watts. A body slowly relearning gravity after months without it. A crew, isolated for a season, learning to hold a silence they know will eventually end. A starship losing contact for good is simply all of these, at once, stretched across a distance long enough that the ending we're used to seeing on Earth never quite arrives. Somewhere past the edge of anything a dish on Earth could ever hear again, a ship like that might still be out there, still lit, faintly, from within, still going.